Stuff to do with family overwhelms me quite a bit. You know, worry or stress around family side of things, that does overwhelm me quite a bit.
The royal family is once again at the center of a storm of speculation, but this time, the situation feels different and significantly more urgent. Just hours ago, Prince William stepped forward to share a health update regarding King Charles that has left the public stunned, but it was a moment of jarring tension that has everyone talking. During a live appearance, as the gravity of the king's condition sank in, Queen Camilla was seen suddenly walking away from the cameras. Was it an emotional exit, or is there something more happening behind palace doors? In this video, we're breaking down the full context of William's sobering announcement, the reality of the king's health battle, and why the Queen's abrupt departure has triggered a massive conversation about what is truly going on within the monarchy. The briefing nobody was supposed to hear about. Sometime in early spring of 2026, Prince William called a meeting. Not a press briefing, not a public appearance. A private meeting with senior household staff and key aides inside the palace. That alone is not unusual. What was unusual was the reason and what was said inside that room. According to sources familiar with the situation, the meeting was called specifically to address King Charles's condition, not to celebrate progress, not to reassure anyone that things were on track. The people in that room were being prepared for something, and the language William used was not the language the palace had been putting out publicly for months. The official line from Buckingham Palace throughout 2025 and into 2026 has been consistent. Charles is receiving treatment. He is continuing his duties where possible. The outlook is positive. That is what the press releases say. That is what spokesmen repeat every time a journalist pushes for details. What William reportedly said in that room was different. Sources describe it as planning language, not a recovery language. There is a significant difference between those two things, and everyone in that room understood it immediately. Recovery language sounds like, "The king is responding well. We expect him to resume full duties in due course." Planning language sounds like, "Here is what needs to be in place. Here is who is responsible for what. Here is how we handle this when it moves to the next stage." That shift is not a small thing inside a royal household. It is the moment an institution stops waiting for things to get better and starts preparing for what comes next. Now here's the first question worth sitting with. Why would William brief senior staff separately from the official communications team? The palace has a whole infrastructure for managing health updates. Spokespeople, press secretaries, communications directors. If this was a routine update, it would have gone through those channels. It didn't. It went through William directly, in a closed room, to a specific group of people. The answer, according to royal insiders, is straightforward. The official communications team manages public perception. What William was doing in that room had nothing to do with public perception. It was operational. He was making sure the people responsible for running the day-to-day functions of the household, the ones who manage schedules, coordinate logistics, handle the machinery of the monarchy, understood the real picture, not the public picture, the real one. That distinction matters. It means the palace is currently operating on two tracks. There is the version being communicated to the press and the public, and there is the version being communicated internally to the people who actually need to know. Those two versions are not the same, and that gap between them is where this story lives. In the first quarter of 2026, his official engagements dropped noticeably compared to the same period in 2025. The engagements he has kept are shorter. There are more gaps between appearances. On February 2026, Charles attended a reception at Windsor Castle. He was there for just under 40 minutes. The previous year, a comparable event ran closer to 90. He shook hands, said the right things, smiled in the right places, and then he left. Earlier than scheduled. Nobody in the press made a significant issue of it at the time, but people inside the palace noticed. This is how royal health situations work. The public finds out long after the people closest to the institution have already read the signs. The schedule changes, the delegation of duties, the way a spokesman starts choosing words more carefully. By the time an official statement lands, the story has been unfolding for months, which brings us back to William's meeting, and to the detail that has not been widely reported. Camilla was not in that briefing. Camilla was informed afterward, not before, not during, after. A senior aide conveyed to her what had been discussed, and when she heard it, she left the room. That detail surfaced through sources close to the household, It has not been officially confirmed or denied by the palace, but multiple people familiar with the internal dynamic have pointed to it as significant. Not because a wife receiving difficult news about her husband is unusual, that part is human, but because of the specific circumstances around it. She was not excluded by accident. In a household as choreographed as Buckingham Palace, nothing happens by accident. William chose who was in that room. Camilla found out through a secondary channel. The people who were there understood that as deliberate, and her response, leaving, was noticed. Royal households are environments where people are trained from day one to manage their reactions professionally. You do not walk out of a room in Buckingham Palace because you are upset. You stay, compose yourself, deal with it later in private. The sources speaking about this moment are not describing it as grief. They are describing it as a disagreement, not about Charles's health itself, about what his health is being used to justify, about who is making the decisions, about a future being planned without her in the room. That is a very different kind of exit, and everything that follows flows from it. What Charles's public appearances are actually telling us. In March of 2026, King Charles attended a Commonwealth engagement at Buckingham Palace. He walked in, greeted the guests, and delivered a short address. The whole thing lasted just over half an hour. Aides had originally scheduled him for closer to an hour and 15 minutes. Nobody announced the change. The schedule was simply adjusted. Quietly. The way these things always are. That is the pattern. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Go back 12 months. In the first quarter of 2025, Charles carried out 31 official engagements. In the same window of 2026, that number was 17. Not a marginal dip, a near halving of his official workload in a single year. Royal correspondents have been tracking this. The numbers are documented in official court circular records, which log every engagement the monarch carries out. They are public. Anyone can look them up. The palace's explanation has been consistent. The king is managing his schedule in line with his treatment. He is prioritizing his energy for the most important duties. He remains engaged with government business through private audiences and correspondence. All of that may be true, but it does not explain everything those appearances are showing. Watch footage from his engagements in late 2025 and compare it to his coronation in May 2023. The difference is visible, not in his composure. Charles has spent his entire life mastering composure in public, but in the physical effort behind it. His movements are more deliberate. His handshakes are shorter. He leans slightly when standing for extended periods, something observers who have followed him for decades say became noticeable in the second half of 2025. One senior royal correspondent described his appearance at a Sandringham event in January 2026 as a man conserving something. That phrase landed because it was precise. He was not unwell in any dramatic visible sense. He was careful, like someone who knows exactly how much he has to spend and is making sure it lasts. That is a specific kind of tiredness, not tired of a busy schedule, the tiredness of a body under sustained pressure. On November 2025, Charles was scheduled to represent the crown at a reception for visiting heads of state, a significant diplomatic event, the kind he would historically have attended without question. He didn't go. William attended in his place. The official reason given was a scheduling conflict. There was no scheduling conflict on the court circular. Royal watchers noticed. The palace did not respond. And that gap between what was said and what the record showed is the kind of thing that sticks. This is how royal institutions manage sensitive information. They do not lie outright. They omit. They adjust language. They let the absence of a denial do the work. By the time anyone pins down a specific discrepancy, the news cycle has moved on. But the pattern has not moved on. It keeps building. On January 2026, Charles delivered the traditional address to the diplomatic corps at Buckingham Palace. He has given that address every year of his reign. In 2026, he gave it seated. Previously, he had stood for the duration. No announcement, no explanation. It was simply done differently, and anyone paying attention understood why. A former senior aide, speaking anonymously to a royal correspondent earlier this year, put it plainly. The difference between a monarch who is ill and a monarch who is declining is that an ill monarch is fighting something. A declining monarch is managing something. And the way Charles's schedule has been structured over the past 6 months reads less like a fight and more like a management. That is a significant thing for someone with that level of access to say. Which is what connects back to William's briefing. William was not using planning language in that room by accident. He is not waiting for any formal process to force his hand. He is preparing the people around him now practically, in the way someone who has watched this institution his entire life knows how to do it. By the time something becomes official in a royal household, the preparation should already be finished. That is what the briefing was. A practical step in a process already underway. And Camilla knows it. Her exit from that room was not the reaction of someone hearing difficult news for the first time. Sources suggest she has been aware of the seriousness of Charles's condition longer than the public has had any indication of. What she heard through that secondary briefing was not a medical update. It was confirmation that William had stopped waiting and started acting, that the institution is now operating under a different set of assumptions than the ones being put out publicly. That is what she walked away from. Not the news about Charles, what the news has already set in motion, and what it means for her place in an institution she spent 20 years earning a seat in. Camilla walks away. What that moment really means. Here is what we know about that room. It was not a formal meeting. No minutes were taken. No official record exists of what was said or who responded how. What we know comes from people close to the household who were either present or told about it shortly after. And what they describe is not a dramatic confrontation. It is something quieter and, in some ways, more telling. Camilla was given a summary of what William had communicated to senior staff, the planning language, the operational shift, the acknowledgement that the institution was no longer operating on the assumption that Charles would return to full capacity. She listened, and then she stood up and left. No argument, no raised voices, she just left. In any other context, that might read as grief. A wife processing something unbearable about her husband's health. That reading deserves to be taken seriously, because she is a wife and Charles is her husband, and that part is real. But the people close to that situation are not describing it as grief. They are describing it as a break, a moment where Camilla removed herself from a process she does not agree with, not from the news itself, from what the news is being used to justify. The tension between William and Camilla did not start here. It has been building for years. The removal of Annabel Elliot from the Duchy of Cornwall payroll in 2023 was the first visible sign. Annabel is Camilla's younger sister. She had worked as an interior designer across duchy properties for nearly 2 decades. When William inherited the duchy, one of his early moves was to remove her from the books entirely and bring in his own people. The message required no translation. This is my house now. These are my decisions. That was 2023. This is 2026. The distance between William and Camilla has not closed. It has widened. Sources describe their relationship as functional but cold, professional in public, united at official events because the institution requires it, but the warmth is not there and has not been for some time. Now, place Camilla in that room, receiving a summary of what William told senior staff, hearing the planning language secondhand, understanding that the institution is already operating under a new set of assumptions, and knowing she was not in the original room where those assumptions were set, not just as a wife processing difficult news, as a queen consort who understands exactly what William's transition means for her position, her access, and her future. Here is the question at the center of this moment. What specifically did she disagree with? Because sources are not describing her exit as emotional collapse. They are describing it as a response to something substantive. One source put it directly. It was not about what was happening to Charles. It was about what happens next, and who gets to decide that. Whether she has any meaningful input into how the institution manages this period, whether she is being consulted or simply informed. The briefing answered that question, and she walked away from the answer. That exit has cost her. In a household like Buckingham Palace, how you behave in a crisis is remembered. Being seen as someone who walks out rather than engages is not a neutral act. It does not make her a villain, but it does make her someone who is not at the table. And in royal politics, being absent from the table has consequences. Her allies inside the palace are fewer than they were 2 years ago. Some have quietly repositioned themselves toward William. The drift has been gradual, but it is real. The Sarah Ferguson situation sits underneath all of this. William has made his position plain. Anyone connected to the Andrew and Epstein scandal must be kept at a clear distance from the crown. Camilla has refused to end that friendship. That refusal has become part of how William reads her, someone whose personal loyalties override institutional needs. Her walking out landed on top of all of that existing history, which leaves the question that carries through everything that follows. Is her exit a calculated signal to Charles that she will not simply accept being sidelined? Or is it a woman pushed to a limit, making the only move available to her? Those two readings lead to very different outcomes. The fault line between William's plan and Camilla's position. In 2025, William and Kate were granted the authority to issue royal warrants. If you are not familiar with what that means, here is the short version. Royal warrants are the official endorsements that allow businesses to display the royal coat of arms and claim they supply goods or services to the crown. Monarchs have historically kept that authority close. It is not something handed to heirs casually or early. The fact that Charles extended it to William and Kate was noted inside the institution as a meaningful and deliberate shift, not ceremonial, operational. That decision did not happen in isolation. It was one of several moves over the past 18 months that have quietly repositioned William from heir to co-authority. Senior staff now copy William on communications that previously went to Charles alone. Certain household decisions that would historically have required the monarch's sign-off are being routed through William's office first. The Duchy of Cornwall, which William has controlled since September 2022, has already been restructured in his image. New people in, old relationships out. The institution is not waiting for a coronation to start operating under new management. It is already doing it, and Camilla is watching from a position that gets smaller with every passing month. Here is the core of the fault line. William has a clear idea of what the monarchy needs to look like going forward. Leaner, more accountable. No tolerance for scandal or the appearance of it. The people around the crown should be there because they earn their place, not because of who they are related to or who they have known for 50 years. Camilla's position inside the royal family is built on entirely different logic. She is there because Charles fought for her, because he chose her publicly, at enormous personal and reputational cost, over 2 decades of scandal and public hostility. Her loyalty to the people in her life, Sarah Ferguson, her sister Annabelle, the relationships she built long before she became a public figure. That loyalty is not incidental to who she is. It is central to it. Those two value systems were always going to collide. The Annabelle Elliott removal was the first collision. Annabelle had worked as an interior designer across duchy properties for nearly 2 decades. When William took over the duchy, he removed her from the payroll entirely and brought in his own people. Inside the family, it set a clear precedent. Personal connections to Camilla carried no weight in William's professional decisions. None. The Sarah Ferguson situation is the second collision, and this one is bigger because it is not about a payroll. It is about the monarchy's public reputation at the most sensitive moment it has faced in a generation. Sarah Ferguson's name appears in the Epstein files. Released documents show direct contact between her and Epstein, including messages where she sought financial help from him. No criminal wrongdoing has been established, but in William's calculation, proximity to that scandal is proximity to that scandal. No exceptions, no allowance for the complexity of a 50-year friendship. Camilla has not complied. The relationship with Sarah has not been severed. William knows it. Sources describe him as having made his expectations plain to Camilla more than once. The message has not been subtle. Distance yourself completely and publicly, or accept that you are actively working against the institution at the worst possible time. She has not done it. What that refusal has produced in practical terms is a steady contraction of her influence. There are conversations happening at senior levels of the palace that she is not part of. Staff who previously sought her input have quietly stopped doing so. Not because anyone issued a direct instruction to exclude her, because people who work inside that hierarchy are skilled at reading which way authority is moving. And it is moving toward William. When he calls a briefing and she hears about it afterward, that is not a scheduling accident. It is a reflection of exactly where she stands. Her residential situation makes all of this more urgent. Right now she lives across multiple royal properties: Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, Sandringham, Balmoral. All of that access flows from Charles being king. When that changes, nearly everything changes with it. Clarence House will likely become her primary residence. But Sandringham and Balmoral passed directly to William. She would be there by invitation only. She sold Ray Mill House in Wiltshire, her private retreat that existed completely outside the royal framework, the place she called her personal escape. It is gone. Her options now exist almost entirely within a structure that William controls. He has conducted himself publicly with civility toward Camilla for years. He attended his father's wedding to her. He has never made a statement against her. But there is a hard boundary in his mind between the personal and the institutional, and the institution belongs to him now. She walked out of that briefing because she heard, in the language being used and the plans being made, exactly how little say she has in what comes next. The only person who still has the authority to change that dynamic is Charles himself. Charles himself, the man caught in the middle. In January of 2026, King Charles held a private audience with the Canadian Prime Minister at Windsor Castle. It lasted 25 minutes. These audiences typically run 40 to 50. Aides had prepared a briefing document covering 6 key areas of discussion. According to a source familiar with the meeting, they got through 3 of them. Charles was engaged and present, but 25 minutes in, he signaled to his private secretary that the meeting was concluding. The Canadian delegation was not caught off guard. They had been quietly briefed beforehand to expect a shorter session. That detail is new. Pre-briefing foreign delegations on reduced timings was not standard practice 18 months ago. It is standard practice now. Charles is aware of all of it. That is the part that gets lost in the coverage of his condition. The focus tends to land on what he can no longer do. What receives far less attention is how deliberate he has been in managing this transition. He is not a passive figure in this story. He is an active one. He became king at 73, the oldest person ever to ascend the British throne. He had waited longer than any heir in history for that moment. And then, barely 17 months after his coronation, his body presented him with a different kind of reckoning. The cancer diagnosis came on February 2024. Treatment began immediately. Throughout 2024 and into 2025, he kept showing up, kept working in a way that most people in his position would not have managed. But something shifted in the second half of 2025. People with regular contact with the king describe a change. Not in his mind. His mental acuity and grasp of detail remain intact by all accounts. The change is physical. He has less to spend. And he knows it. In October 2025, Charles made a series of quiet adjustments to his private office structure. Certain correspondence that previously required his personal sign-off was rerouted. A number of ceremonial commitments he had maintained throughout his reign were removed from his forward schedule. None of this was announced. It appeared in the absence of entries on the court circular, where entries had previously existed. When a journalist pressed his private secretary on one of these absences, the response was that the king's schedule is kept under continuous review. That is the language of managed decline. And Charles authorized that language. Here is what makes his position genuinely complicated. Charles is not simply stepping back. He is stepping back in a specific direction, toward William. Deliberately, in ways that go beyond what ill health alone would require. The royal warrants granted to William and Kate in 2025 were Charles's decision. The expanded role William played in the Andrew situation was sanctioned by Charles. The briefings William has been conducting with household staff, the ones using planning language rather than recovery language, are not happening without Charles's knowledge. A private secretary does not allow a future king to walk into a room and address senior staff about the monarch's condition without the monarch knowing. Charles knows, and Charles has not stopped it. He is not just managing his illness, he is managing his succession, actively, consciously, and faster than anyone outside the palace has been officially told. Which brings us to the hardest part of his position. He is doing all of this while watching it affect his wife in ways he cannot fully protect her from. Sources describe Charles and Camilla's private relationship during this period as genuinely warm. He confides in her. She is present for the difficult days in a way that goes beyond duty. That part of their story is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged plainly. But he is also a king. And as a king, he has concluded that William's vision for the institution is the right one. He believes the monarchy's best chance of surviving its current pressures is under William's leadership, and he has chosen to support that, even when it creates friction with Camilla. When Camilla has pushed back on William's decisions, particularly around Sarah Ferguson, Charles has not taken her side. Sources confirm he has consistently defended William's position in those conversations. He understands why she feels the way she does, but he does not override William on it. That is an extraordinary thing for a husband to do, and it tells you exactly where his priorities sit. Has Charles privately accepted something about his prognosis that his public statements have not reflected? Based on everything his actions suggest, yes. A man still operating on the assumption of meaningful recovery does not restructure his office, pre-brief foreign delegations on shortened audiences, or sanction his son speaking to senior staff in the language of institutional planning. He has looked at his situation clearly and is building accordingly, placing William in the right rooms, giving him the right authorities, preparing the ground in a way that nobody fully prepared for him. The cost of that is real. Some of it falls on Camilla. Charles carries that quietly, the way he has carried most difficult things, without making it anyone else's burden. But there is one thing he cannot resolve from where he stands. What happens between William and Camilla after he is gone, when there is no longer a king to sit between them, when the institution belongs entirely to one of them? That is the question Charles cannot answer, and it is the one that matters most. When the crown passes, who Camilla becomes and what she loses. There is a photograph taken at Balmoral in the summer of 2024. Camilla is walking across the grounds with two of her dogs. She looks relaxed, at ease in a way that public appearances rarely capture. Balmoral does that to people who love it. The scale of it, 53,000 acres of Scottish Highland, the quiet, the distance from London, and everything London represents. It has been the private sanctuary of the royal family for generations. Queen Elizabeth died there. Charles retreats there whenever the weight of the role becomes too heavy. Camilla has spent significant time at Balmoral throughout Charles's reign. It has become part of her life in a real daily sense, not just a backdrop for official photographs. A place she actually knows and uses, and by all accounts loves. She will not have the right to be there when William is king. That is not speculation. That is the legal and constitutional reality of what happens when the crown passes. Balmoral is personally owned by the monarch. It is not a crown estate, not a government property, not managed by any public body. It transfers privately, directly, from one monarch to the next. Charles inherited it from his mother. William will inherit it from Charles. And with that inheritance comes full authority over who uses it, who visits, and who is quietly not extended an invitation. The same applies to Sandringham, 120 acres in Norfolk, the Christmas home of the royal family for generations. Charles owns it personally. William will own it personally. Camilla's presence there has always been by virtue of being Charles's wife. That basis disappears the moment Charles does. What she does inherit is more limited than most people realize. Clarence House, valued at approximately £72 million, is expected to become her primary residence. That arrangement has precedent. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, lived at Clarence House for decades after George VI died. It is the established home for a Queen Dowager, and Camilla moving there is the most likely outcome. Highgrove House in Gloucestershire, Charles's private country retreat for more than 40 years, valued at around £39 million, may remain accessible to her depending on the arrangements made. Charles has spoken about Highgrove with deep personal attachment throughout his life. The gardens there represent decades of his work. What happens to that property after his death has not been publicly resolved. Financial support would be provided. A sovereign grant allocation for a Queen Dowager is standard. She would not be left without resources. But here is what that package actually represents when you lay it out plainly. A house, some financial support, access to Highgrove, possibly. And everything else, the estates, the private residences, the spaces that have formed the texture of her daily life for the past 2 decades, are gone. Or, more precisely, no longer hers to assume. Now set the financial picture aside for a moment and look at the symbolic one. In 2024, Camilla wore the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara for the first time. It is one of the most significant pieces in the royal collection. Queen Elizabeth wore it on British currency for decades. It is the kind of object that carries weight far beyond its physical value. The fact that Camilla wore it was itself a statement, a visual signal of her place in the succession of royal women who have held the highest position this institution offers. When William becomes king, Kate becomes queen consort. And Kate wearing that tiara will mean something different. It will mean the transfer is complete, not just administratively, not just constitutionally, but symbolically. The image will shift, the woman at the center of it will shift, and Camilla will move from the foreground to somewhere further back. That transition has already begun in smaller ways. Watch the choreography of public appearances over the past year, where Camilla stands in official photographs, the order of precedence at state events. These things are managed with extraordinary precision inside the palace. Nothing about positioning is accidental, and the positioning has been changing. Here is the detail that cuts most sharply into the future she is facing. Ray Mill House in Wiltshire. Camilla owned it privately before she married Charles. It was her retreat, the place that existed entirely outside the royal framework, the garden she described as the best therapy in the world, a property that belonged to her, not to the institution, not to the crown, not to any future king's inheritance. She sold it. The timing of that sale matters. It happened as Charles's condition was becoming harder to manage publicly, as William's operational authority was expanding, as the question of what comes next was moving from abstract to immediate. Whether the sale was financially motivated, practically motivated, or something else entirely, the effect is the same. The one piece of private ground she had outside the institution's reach is gone. Her options now exist almost entirely within a framework that William controls. That is the practical reality. But there is a layer beneath the practical that is harder to quantify and probably harder for Camilla to sit with. She spent 20 years becoming acceptable. That is not an exaggeration. When Charles married her on April 2025, public opinion in Britain was not warm toward her. The polls at the time showed a significant portion of the public had not forgiven her for what they saw as her role in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage. She was tolerated at best by large sections of the British public, accepted by some, genuinely liked by fewer. What followed was 2 decades of steady, disciplined public service, the literacy campaigns, domestic abuse advocacy, the quiet, consistent accumulation of causes and appearances, and carefully handled public moments. By the time Charles was crowned in May 2023, she was queen consort. By 2025, polling showed her approval ratings had reached their highest point ever. She built that, methodically, over a very long time, against genuine public resistance. And the question she now faces is what that work is worth, in a world where William is king and Kate is queen consort, and the institution has moved on to its next chapter. The answer, bluntly, is that it does not transfer. The goodwill she accumulated is attached to her role. When the role diminishes, the platform diminishes with it. A queen dowager carries weight, but it is a different kind of weight. Less active, less central, more historical. There is one more thing worth stating directly because it sits underneath everything else in this section. William has never publicly said anything against Camilla. He has been civil, at times warm, consistently professional. Nothing in his public conduct toward her suggests personal hostility. But his professional decisions tell a different story, not of hostility, of indifference to her position. The duchy restructuring, the staff changes, the briefings she is informed of rather than included in. These are not the actions of someone who factors Camilla's interests into his institutional decisions. She spent 20 years earning her place in this institution. William has spent the last 3 making it clear that the place she earned belongs to Charles's reign, and Charles's reign is ending. That is what she walked away from in that room. Not the news itself, the full weight of what the news means, the estates she will leave, the title that will change, the platform that will shrink, and the man who will control all of it, who has already shown her, clearly and without drama, exactly where she stands in the world he is building. The crown passes. And when it does, so does almost everything she has spent 2 decades holding on to. There are queens who shape an institution, and there are queens who get shaped by what comes after them. Camilla built something real over 20 years, the public acceptance, the causes, the carefully earned credibility. But she built it inside Charles's reign.